got like an Oprah walk-on there. That was really
Which
very
we did
exciting.
together, by the way.
But we didn't do it with the kind of zeal I had hoped, but there's always next time.
We did Oprah together.
So
though.
we
Yeah.
did, but it wasn't our best moment, I thought. And they wouldn't mention our books because when you do Oprah, you sort of do it on Oprah's rules.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't. So I said, I have this book coming out, and they said, yeah, and they didn't put it on there. And I don't think they got my name right. And we were sort of in a weird panel, and there was. Do you remember that? It was not.
Yeah, I do remember it. And I also remember another thing about it.
Right.
At that
She's
point,
going to tell a really embarrassing story, which is a great story, though.
you would not fly.
Well, I got very neurotic. It was like right after 9/11, and we got to the airport, and it was very rainy, and I wouldn't get on the plane.
And Molly said, it will be so easy. We'll just go to the Central train station in Chicago, and we'll get on an overnight train, and it will be so much fun, Mommy.
And it was like 27 hours. It was really bad.
And then I have to tell you something about Molly. After Molly had her 3 children, she said, I can't believe you wrote this book, and you're not afraid of flying, and I am.
But you're also actually really neurotic. That's like the secret is that she's a little neurotic.
Okay,
too.
so
all right, we have to introduce each other. We still haven't introduced each other. This is my mom, Erica Jong. She's written many, many books, 4,700 books.
No, 27 books in 45 languages,
50,000
including
languages.
Arabic. Amazing. And Chinese.
But the secret
Mandarin.
about those books in the cool languages is that nobody knows what they say because you can't read them. So we were just talking about this before because this Egyptian journalist said, I can't believe Fear of Flying has been translated into Arabic. And Mom said, what is it censored? Because none of us know. Because none of us can read it.
We can't read Arabic.
So
in our next
idea.
life, we'll learn.
So that's always the kind of thing where you don't really know. But anyway, so I'm introducing my mom. Your new book is this book right here.
The World Began with Yes.
Which is a book of poetry.
And I'm writing my autobiography. And I've been working on it here in Santa Fe. And I like it. It's really funny. And I realized while I'm writing it that I have known absolutely everybody in the world. I was friends with Henry Miller. I met Ingmar Bergman.
But she never dated Henry Miller. And by never dated Henry Miller.
He was 88. He was like my grandfather.
Right.
And I adored my grandfather, so I adored Henry. And he was 88 during our friendship. It was not an erotic friendship.
Jesus
just
Christ.
For the record. It was a sort of writerly grandfather-granddaughter relationship. And it was wonderful.
So I'm going to ask you a question that a lot of people have about Mom, and which is, how did you get the name Erica Jong?
Okay, before I met your father, I was married to a Chinese-American child psychiatrist called Alan Jong. And Alan was American-born, but he was Chinese, and he really was...
And you took his name?
He loved my writing, and he wanted me to use his name. And then when we got divorced, he wanted me to change my name. And I just said, I'm sorry, it's too late. But anyway, so that's how that happened. But I'm not Dutch.
But it was like 2 or 3 husbands ago. So I've never met him. That's an
But you
important
met
part of
his
the story.
daughters.
But I have his name, so.
We were giving a reading together at Barnes & Noble in Manhattan, and it was based on a children's book I wrote for Molly called Molly's Book of Divorce.
Which by the way, is an amazing story, that children's book.
Anyway.
My father sued my mother about the children's book, and then they couldn't call it Molly's Book of Divorce anymore, so they had to call it Megan's Book of Divorce.
Right.
It was a very
And it was,
fraught
by then the
time.
book was dead.
Yeah,
You
it
know,
was-
enough lawsuits
Yeah,
and a book
it's
is
never
dead.
children's books with many lawsuits. Never a good.
Never.
That's not what you want for your kid's book.
But it was okay. I mean, it's a good book.
I mean,
and it
who
was
knows?
nearly a television series, but then it wasn't.
Like
Like so
was
many
it?
television series.
What was it a television series of?
It was a television series about a woman who gets divorced.
Loretta Swit.
And it was
They
supposed to
made
be.
a pilot of this television series.
And Loretta Swit was playing me. And what
You can
casting-
tell it was the 80s, right? Because of Loretta Swit. And
Anyway, and it went all the way to the top of.
we saw the pilot.
Yeah.
But
And then, as always happens with television series, some man at the top said, "We're not making this."
I don't know how good it was. I mean, I saw it. I don't know that it was so
It was
good. I
a
remember
tele-
it not
Molly,
being
it
so
was a
good.
television pilot.
Okay,
My
all
God.
right, all right. Not to be the voice of,
Anyway,
dissent here.
in show business, things often are optioned, and sometimes they are shot. And then just when you're about to have a television series that's going to make you rich forever, some man at the top cancels it. And
so,
that's been
Mom,
what's happened to me anyway.
Will you talk a little bit about how you got into writing? Because I think people are interested in that.
I always wrote my whole life. I grew up in a family of artists, and I drew pictures, and I wrote as long as I can remember back. And my grandfather was a portrait painter, and he taught me how to paint. And my mother was a painter, and my aunt was a painter, and they were all very, very good. And at a certain point in my life, I thought, fuck this, I'm not competing with them, I'm going to write. And that is the truth.
Did you said this very interesting thing about grandma recently that I didn't know, which was that, so my grandmother was pretty insane. I think that's a generous, I mean, she was very nutty, but in a very fun and interesting way. And she painted all of the toilet seats in her house with roses on them. And she had sheets on the window. There was all sorts of weird stuff going on there.
My
She
mother was
very
sort of bipolar.
but she was creative and wonderful. She wasn't. I think she was wonderful and strange. I think she was also an alcoholic. But I think that's fair. I think that's a fair understatement.
It's a fair thing to say.
But
there was a lot of addiction going on in my family. Let me just
But
tell
you
you
told
that.
me this very interesting thing about her, which was that she saw all female doctors. Like she made sure that
My
you guys had all these.
grandmother only saw female dentists. My grandmother was of the suffrage generation. She would not go to male dentists or doctors. My mother went to the National Academy of Design. Her best friend was a woman called Lee Krasner, and they were buddies. And there are two portraits of Lee Krasner in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that my mother did, and that they pull out when they do an abstract expressionism show. Mm-hmm. But the tragedy in my family was they were all realistic painters in the age of abstraction, so they were very bitter. And my mother,
they were very bitter.
And my mother told a story that when she was at the National Academy of Design in New York City, she was called in by the head of the academy, and he said, "You're the best painter in your class. You're the best draftsperson in your class. There's nothing you can't do. You can draw, you can paint in oil, you can paint in watercolor, but you're not getting the Prix de Rome." And my mother said, "But why? If I'm the best, why am I not getting the Prix de Rome?" "Because you're a woman, you'll have children and waste your talents." And when people ask me how I became a feminist, I was always a feminist because my mother told me this story when I was 6. And from then on, I was determined to avenge her.
Yeah, that's good.
And my grandmother was very supportive of women also. So I didn't have to read The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir to know that I was a feminist.
Your grandparents were born in Russia?
Yes, they were born in Russia.
And then when did they come over?
They went to England. They both came from Odessa, which was a very Jewish city. and they met in London. And in London, my grandfather first went to Paris because he was a painter, and painters always went to Paris in that era. And he starved in Paris. Then he made his way to London, where he got work painting boudoirs, cherubs on ladies' ceilings, whatever work he could get. And he could do anything. He was the most talented draftsman I've ever seen in my life. He even made little tiny portraits for lockets. He had these tiny brushes with sable threads. Anyway, he made himself a success in London, and he met this beautiful Russian woman with enormous round blue eyes, which I seem to have inherited, and her name was Eugenia, and he fell in love with her and they got married. Then the First World War came. They immediately had 2 daughters. And then the First World War came, and my grandfather said, better get out of here and get to New York, because they were going to draft him. So he took off for New York, where he became, again, a very successful artist, doing everything, portraits, lockets.
Did he do portraits like for other, as a secret painter for other more famous artists?
He had an agent at one point who went down to Palm Beach, which was very elegant, and would get him jobs painting. But Papa didn't sign his own name because it was a Jewish name, Mirsky. And so the other guy would sign his name and would give him half the fee. But Papa, my grandfather, during the Great Depression, he was making a living as an artist, a good living as an artist, and supporting the entire family, which is practically a miracle. But that was my grandfather, Mirsky. And I write a lot about him in the autobiography because, in a way, he was my mentor. He taught me to paint. He applauded my poems and stories. He was really my dad, in a way, because my parents were bohemians and hippies, and they were running around like maniacs going to Provincetown and you know, smoking marijuana and running around. And my grandparents were the rocks in the family. So I grew up, I think I was very lucky.
Did your grandparents live with you when you were growing up?
We all lived together, and Papa paid the rent. My mother, who I called Ida, and my father, who I called Seymour, and my grandparents were Mama and Papa.
Yeah.
And they were the rocks in the family. And then my parents, my older sister and I both called them by first names. Yeah. But Claudia, my younger sister, calls them Mommy and Daddy. Because by the time...
They got to be better parents when they got to Claudia.
They got to be parents, period. Right? You know, they were bohemians. They were always going to Provincetown and running around.
So would you talk a little bit about like this sort of, you weren't really a hippie, because you're a little bit older than that, right?
I'm a war baby.
Right. So
I was born during the Second World War. So is Ken.
Because you were actually living on a base during the Vietnam War, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's an interesting cultural moment.
My then husband, who was a child psychiatrist, was drafted during Vietnam. And they hadn't drafted doctors since Korea. But they needed a lot of doctors. And Alan said, you know, they can't tell the difference between Asians. I'm Chinese, although I was born in America. Some Viet Cong is going to assassinate me, I'm sure. So I said, so what can you do? He said, if I give the army 3 years, they'll let us go to Europe. And so and I said, good, because I understood that people can't identify one Asian from another.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
Well,
anyway,
in some places it's true.
But so talk about living. So you during the Vietnam War, you were living in Germany.
I was living in Heidelberg on an army base. I was teaching English at the University of Maryland's Overseas Division. I was writing poetry, and I was starting Fear of Flying. I wrote Fear of Flying throughout my 20s. And a lot of it was written in Germany.
Will you talk, thing, we went to Heidelberg together to do a documentary a long time ago.
Right.
And one of the things you talked a lot about that really struck me, because this is like Germany in the 60s,
Right.
was that a lot of the books in the library, can you talk about that? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
You know, the Americans had a denazification program after World War II. You may know this or not. And so they went through the libraries in Heidelberg and Munich and other places and covered all the pictures of Hitler's rallies with oak tag patches because they didn't want anyone, you know, we had America houses all over Germany, which were wonderful because soft power. American writers would come, American jazz musicians would come and would entertain. And a lot of people began to see America not as an invading country, but as a cultural force. So I'm a great believer in soft power.
It was an interesting thing, too, though, because it was so soon after World War II, in a way. Like, I mean, it was really only 20
years after.
Yeah, to be
but
living there.
There were still, you could see in Germany, for example, in Heidelberg, where we lived, there was this huge amphitheater called the Tingstätte, where Hitler used to have his rallies. And I remember going there and seeing, you know, they were built all over Germany. So I was very aware of the Holocaust. The traces of the Holocaust were there. They're all gone now in modern Germany. And actually there was a great rebellion against the Holocaust culturally. But it's very interesting. The time I lived there, we were 20 years after the end of the war, but there were still many things that reminded you of Hitler.
Will you talk a little bit about how publishing Fear of Flying changed your life?
It was kind of amazing.
It was published in 1973.
Right.
And
I had published 2 books of poetry. I was considered a coming younger poet. I won prizes from Poetry Magazine Chicago. And then my editor at Holt said, but are you working on a novel? You must be working on a novel. Everybody's working on a novel. And I said, yes, in fact, I've written a novel called The Man Who Murdered Poets. And I brought it in for him to read. And he read the book and he said, beautifully written, it's brilliant, and I won't publish it. And I said, why? And he said, well, you've written it from a man's point of view. And I said, but all the people who get good reviews, Roth, Bellow, Updike, they're all men. And he said, yes, but I'm not going to publish this. You can take it to Farrar Straus or wherever. They'll publish it. I want you to go home and write a novel in the voice of those incredible poems. In other words, a contemporary woman's voice. And I had all these things in my notebooks that I had been writing, but I hadn't dared to make them into a novel because I knew they were explosive and I was scared to publish them. And so I started a novel in the voice of my poems. And that was the best piece of advice I ever got from an editor.
And when did it came out in 1973?
It came out, well, the first sign that the book would do well was that the galleys kept being stolen in the publishing house. They could never print enough pre-galleys because people would take them home.
Did you?
And my editor, Aaron Asher, said to me, well, we'll probably sell 5,000 copies of that, but people are stealing galleys, and I think that's a good sign. Then Elaine Coster, who was head of New American Library, there were a few women running publishing houses in 1971, a few. And Elaine read the book, and she said, this book is the story of my life, and I will buy the paperback rights, but I will not buy them if you don't print a minimum of 35,000 copies. Wow. And he said, but we'll eat them. this is a literary book, we'll never sell any. And Elaine said, then I won't buy the paperback rights. My deal with you is you print at least 35,000 and you print another 300,000 galleys, and I send them all to my big mouth list. And because there was a woman in the position as head of a publishing house, the book was not lost.
Yeah.
When you think of all the books that might have been lost
Right.
because the head of the publishing house was a guy who didn't identify. But I got lucky.
And then when it came out, like, when did you think, like, oh, wow?
The first year, they never had enough books. And it was the book everybody had heard about and couldn't get. And then they printed 35,000 copies, and it would go on the bottom of the New York Times bestseller list, and then completely out of stock. And friends of mine would call me on the phone and say, Erica, there are no books in the stores. Erica, there are no books in the stores.
That would
Erica,
make me so anxious.
It made me so anxious. And then the next fall, the book came out in paperback. And with Signet Books, it was $1.95.
Jesus.
And I want to tell you that one of my theories about publishing is that if a book is $1.95 in drugstores all over, people take a chance on an author they don't know.
Yeah.
And I think we have to do that again.
Did they have ads in the back of the book?
No, we wouldn't allow that.
Yeah, because that was.
But the most famous agent in New York said, this book will never sell, I won't represent it.
Who was that?
Lynn Nesbitt.
Oh, she's still
And
around.
there were many people who were really upset about it or thought it was...
Did you get in trouble for the sex? And didn't you get in
Did
trouble
I-
with the NEA?
Did I get in trouble? Did I get in trouble? I had had a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. And someday, if you want to be laughing your ass off, you can read the Congressional Record, where a bunch of fat old senators are arguing about Erica Jong and Fear of Flying. It's kind of an honor.
Did they make you give back the money to the NEA?
It was so little money, Molly. It's not even a dress you would buy. It was like.
All right. Anyway.
Yeah, okay.
So
it was
what-
like
all right,
$2,500 or something.
Anyway.
Okay.
So, can you tell us? So you knew it was going to be a big deal. Did you?
Only when the paperback came out.
Right.
When 3 million copies sold in 3 months.
And
then I knew something was going on.
And then what happened? Did you how mad were your sisters? Sorry,
My sisters love me and hate me, and you know the whole story, and that's another book.
They were mad though, right?
No, it wasn't my sisters who were mad. It was that a lot of women writers were mad at me because the book was selling well. A lot of male writers were mad at me because they thought I was a slut writing books.
You didn't. Have
I got every kind of reaction you can imagine.
But you didn't have you didn't have siblings, parents, nobody mad.
No, my
like that?
mother used to say, "Darling, you're a great poet, but when I read your novels, I believe I'm reading my obituary."
Oh, that's such a weird thing to say.
But
By the
my
way,
mother was very
sidebar,
honest.
She said stuff like that all the time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, she was very dramatic.
Yeah.
What can you talk a little bit about what it must have been like to? So then you met my dad right after that, right?
There was going to be a movie made of. I was married to Alan,
Yeah.
a child psychiatrist, and there was going to be a movie.
For those playing at home, husband number 2.
Right.
Right.
My first husband went crazy and thought he was Jesus Christ.
That was a short
My
marriage.
schizophrenic
Short
first husband.
Okay. Second marriage.
So second marriage was Alan, a really nice guy, very handsome,
Okay.
very
Yeah,
tall,
let's
very
move on.
athletic. And Asian American men come up to me at
Okay,
readings
so-
and say, "You made us into sex symbols." which I think is kind of cute.
All right, third
Okay.
husband.
So
You
what?
go to California.
I go to California because there's going to be a movie made of Fear of Flying. And
What-
my friends, Howard and Betty Fast, grandparents to my daughter Molly, say, our son Jonathan is going to pick you up at the hotel. Jonathan comes in a little red MG.
Green.
Green, okay, green MG. And I look at him, and he looks at me, and we fell in love. And
then you
that's
had
how
to go-
you came to be.
And then you had to go to get a divorce in the Dominican Republic,
Yeah, right.
which is a great story.
I went to the Dominican Republic, as people did in those days, and a guy picked me up in
Her
a little...
lawyer was also her driver,
Right.
right?
He came to pick me up at the airport, and he said, I am your driver and your lawyer. Now we go to the courthouse. And it was a courthouse
only-
with chickens running around.
But it was only one day, right? The whole Dominican.
You had to stay overnight one night.
One night. It's pretty
And
good.
then after you got the divorce in the Dominican Republic, the lawyer who was driving this golden Volkswagen Beetle said, now you are divorced, we get ice cream.
Is it-
And he took me to an ice cream factory and bought me a huge ice cream cone. It was really, you couldn't make it up.
It's a great. It's probably it's a pretty good story. How hard was it to sit down and write another book after that? Because you
Well-
must have known nothing is ever gonna. No, I'm sorry. I'm going into my own psychology here.
No, but what I want to say is I then flew to California to live with Molly's father. And we lived in Malibu at a time when Malibu, in a scuzzy rented house, looking down on the Pacific. And it was a time when you could drive from Malibu to downtown LA in 40 minutes, which it means it was a long time ago. And we lived there, and we were madly in love. And
you live next to a rock band.
we did. We lived next to a rock band, and we
Yeah.
lived on a little, right near Pepperdine University, and on a little rise above Shirley MacLaine's house. And we used to walk on the beach, and that's how I met Shirley, who I believe lives here now, who was very lovely and nice. Anyway,
I wanted to know about the book after Fear of Flying.
well, when I lived in Malibu, Mario Puzo, who had written The Godfather, called me up and said, I'm going to take you to lunch, and I want to talk to you about your life. I said, okay. So we went to a Chinese restaurant, and he said, Erica, you've had this hit book. It's sold gazillions of copies. Forget writing another book. They'll kill you. I can get you jobs writing movies, and you'll make much more money. You'll move out here, and you won't have to suffer with the way writers are going to torture you for your first success. And I said, but Mario, if I don't write my second book, I can't write my third book. And if I don't write my third book, I can't write my fourth book. And if I don't write my fourth book, and he looked at me as if I was insane. And he said, you're absolutely wrong, and you'll publish your second novel, and everyone will jump all over it and say you're, a flash in the pan and an idiot. And I warned you, don't ever forget it.
Mario Puzo wrote more books.
No, he had written a lot of very artistic novels before The Godfather, but he had a huge family he had to support. And he wanted to buy a house for his sister. All that Italian-American love for family. He wanted to buy a house for his sister and a house for his daughter. And so he decided, damn it, I'm going to write something commercial.
Right. I think that happens. I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald talks about the idea of like going to California to make money and cash in, as a writer. So I mean, I think it's like
a
trope
dream
that's been,
of writers.
right.
I really hate the film business. I think, they they flatter you, they love you, they option you and option you and option you, and then the movie never gets made. And at least I'm writing books that I believe in. I never wrote for money. Call me crazy. I wrote what I had to write. And I have made money. Some of my books have been successful, some have not. They're published all over the world.
Can you talk about a little bit about what the book that you feel like is the most meaningful to you that you've written? And
my best novel is Fanny Being the True History of the Adventures of Fanny Hackabout Jones. It's a picaresque novel about an orphan girl, a kind of female Tom Jones, who is seduced by her stepfather and in shame and horror at having lost her virginity to a man who has no respect for her and laughs about it afterwards with his mistress. She gets on her horse and gallops away to London. And in the process of, she meets witches, she meets highwaymen, she gets pregnant with her daughter, and she writes a book as a letter to her daughter about life and love. And it's my best book, without a doubt. Julie Taymor is making it into a TV series, we hope.
And some of that is also because before, when you were writing Fear of Flying, you were actually working on a PhD.
In 18th century English literature. So I loved Pope and Swift. I loved satire. And that's why I was studying 18th century. I was sort of ABD, all but dissertation. And then my darling son-in-law, your husband, got me a PhD, honoris causa.
Yeah.
So now I'm Dr. Jong.
Yeah, but you can't ever be called that. We're going to go to questions in like a few minutes, but I wanted to ask you just a couple more things about what do you think the job, like I think it's interesting, what I think a lot about is like what the world was like in 1973 when you wrote Fear of Flying, and the job of the woman writer, you know, how important Fear of Flying was to sort of change the narrative. And what do you think the job of the woman writer is today? You know, I mean, obviously we're just writers, right? We're the same as men, but we're also not the same as men. And we've lived through this, things are still so unequal in certain ways. And we've also come so far since 1973. So I'm curious to know what you think, like how it's changed for you, how you've seen the world change, and what your hope is.
There was a woman writer in the 18th century who wrote this line: "Alas, the woman who attempts the pen, such an intruder on the rights of men." Now, has it changed? In some ways, it hasn't. In many ways, it hasn't. We have the right to vote, but we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment, which has been kicking around for 169 years. We thought we had Roe v. Wade, and that women could have their health care and abortions if they needed them, and now all of a sudden everything's under threat.
When Fear of Flying came out, was it censored? Can you talk a little bit about that censorship?
It was censored in Italy. People in England denounced it.
Wasn't it censored from libraries too, or there?
It was censored in libraries, yes.
So what did that mean exactly? Because that's sort of interesting.
Well, it meant it was censored in South Africa, so they used to sell it from under the counter. When a book is censored, it's a kind of crazy thing. In Italy, it was censored in the south of Italy, the Italian translation, but it got people very excited to read the book. So sometimes censorship, makes the book more interesting.
But so would libraries not buy it, or would they not shelve it, or what did that mean?
It depends on which country
but in the
you're
United
talking
States.
about. In the U.S., there were people denouncing me. The Erica Jongs of this world will make all women bounce from bed to bed and leave their marriages and never whatever. And so that was the initial response of some people. Some people, like Henry Miller and John Updike, said, this is a revolutionary book that will change women's lives and men's lives. But it was a long road to becoming an icon, because in the beginning I got lots of flack.
But I also think it's interesting how the world has changed for women writing about
Not
sex.
enough.
Right, but that you can...
I'm very disappointed that all of a sudden we're worried about Roe v. Wade because we have Trump and Pence and the GOP war on women. I can't believe that we're fighting the same battles again. My grandmother and my mother would have said the same, probably, because my mother grew up wanting to be a flapper, although she was a little too old to be a flapper, but she grew up wanting freedom and thinking that we had won it. But the women's revolution pushes forward and moves back, pushes forward and moves back. It's true, we have more women lawyers, we have more women judges, thank God. We have more women doctors, but we're always in danger of losing the rights again. And that I find appalling.
What, so... Did you? I remember when you were touring with Fear of Flying, you would talk a lot about like how hard it was to be a woman in hotels. Remember?
Remember, Molly once was surprised. She said,
"It shocked me."
She was shocked. I said, whenever I was in a hotel, I would order room service in front of the TV. I would never go down to the dining room. And your response was?
No, you said I would always feel uncomfortable as a woman eating alone. That meant that, you would often feel like men were, the implication was, that you weren't sort of safe eating by yourself.
A lot of men feel that if a woman is attractive and she's alone, that she's available, or a prostitute, or...
I think this is less true now.
I hope so. But in many places, it hasn't changed. Look at all the people in politics who have been having orgies with little girls young enough to be their granddaughters.
Mom,
it's appalling to me.
All right, so let's... somebody had asked me a question about, like, would... if Mrs. Pence could read Fear of Flying... what would happen? But I don't think that's it. That's not really a question. That's more of a statement.
I would hope that she would laugh and enjoy it, but I don't think so. She doesn't let her husband have dinner with another woman, apparently. So I don't think she has fantasies of freedom.
So you're
but
working.
Whatever.
So you're working on another book,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's an autobiography, and tell us how that's going to be different. You've written memoirs before, but will you just talk a little bit about how that's different?
Well, when you reach your 70s, an amazing thing happens. You remember your childhood much more vividly. I don't know where this comes from, but from time to time I have flashes to my childhood, and I remember exactly where I was and the conversation. It's a wonderful thing about getting older. The flashbacks, the memories, it's fabulous. And I think that we don't give a lot of credit to older stages of life and how we change and how we're so afraid of aging in America. And yet, there are things about aging that are wonderful. Molly has given me 3 grandchildren. My oldest grandson is 15. He's a teenager. He's sharing a room with me in the hotel we're in.
He's a socialist.
He's a socialist,
He's a Bernie bro.
He's a Bernie bro. And he likes to argue about politics.
He was originally voting for Mike Gravel, but then Gravel dropped out, so he was pretty upset, but he's feeling good about it.
And then there are the twins, Darwin and Bet, who are Molly's twins, who are adorable, and they're 11 and a half, going on 12. And they're so smart, and they're so funny. And Darwin became a vegetarian when he was 8, and he won't eat meat because he loves animals. I mean, this is the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me in my life, these grandchildren. You know, everybody says, should have had them first.
As soon as I had my kids, and my dad said, you know, what's interesting about grandchildren is you have none of the mixed feelings you have about your own children. So I was like, thanks, Dad. So my parents really like my kids, which is good for them.
Oh, they're so wonderful. And it's like, you know, going into the future, being with these kids. It's like living in the future. And you stop worrying about your own stuff, about getting older. It's getting, by the way, I think, I have a friend who's a psychiatrist who has a therapy group of all people above 90. And she says, this is the most interesting group I've ever had. And weirdly, coming out here to Albuquerque, I met a woman who was sitting next to me on the plane, a psychologist, and she's writing a book about people in their 80s and 90s and how amazing and wonderful they are. She said, we don't appreciate the changes that come with age that are positive, not negative. And I'm aware of the negative changes. My husband has just been diagnosed with Parkinson's. We went through a huge moment when we were both very scared. And now he's exercising and he's doing all kinds of stuff and taking medications that are helping him and looking at his life in a different way. Getting older is not boring. It really isn't. And there are many wonderful things about it. So when I write the autobiography, I'm writing from a different point of view than I've ever had before. And my vision of myself in the world is different.
I think we should go to questions because I think people have questions, and I think that would be fun. Do you guys? I don't want to leave. Okay, good. Yes.
I wanted to ask Molly one thing.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
I'll be quick.
Molly's in her early 20s published 3 novels. 1 novel, 2 novels, and a memoir. And they were
one
wonderful.
of them was sold so poorly that we changed the title for the paperback.
Okay.
That is never, by the way, if you see a book where there are different titles in the hardcover and the paperback, not a good sign.
Okay.
You can always see
Molly,
that.
look, you wrote these 3 wonderful books in your early 20s, and they were really good. And I wasn't allowed to look at them at all because I'm too nice, and she says I don't edit her, and I'm a nice mommy. And
The Jewish
if
mom.
you had had a mother like mine, you'd be
Jewish
a
mother.
nice mother. I
It's
wanted
true.
to do the
Her
opposite.
mother was not a Jewish mother. I mean, she
Anyway.
was Jewish, but she wasn't so nice.
Anyway, then Molly had her 3 kids, and she is a phenomenal mother of 3 rather difficult, brilliant kids.
Difficult.
And now she's writing political commentary. And she's writing for the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Observer in London
Yeah.
and a million other papers. And she is writing these wonderful, funny pieces. What is it like being a political commentator as opposed to a novelist?
Oh, all right.
That's my question to you.
I mean, it's like such an interesting time to write about politics because everything is insane. So, and there's so much insane stuff that it's an incredibly. I mean, the problem is it's so terrible. Some of the stuff is so bleak and so terrible that you want to give it the kind of rage it deserves, but also to talk about it in the way.
You're very funny.
But I mean,
she's a passionate feminist, and she's writing about the war on women. And she's just written a fabulous article about revoking Title IX.
Right, and Planned Parenthood.
But
it's an I mean, it's like, you know, it's a hard. I mean, I feel it's better for me because I get to write these opinion pieces and I don't have to report. I think it's very tough for reporters because a lot of people don't like the news. because it's so terrible, and so they get mad at the reporters if they, I mean, it's an interesting, it's tough for them because they want to say that Trump is a liar because he obviously is, but you can't just say that. It's very tough to I think it's a very tough time for reporters because they don't have any, the closest thing to Trump is Mussolini, right, or Hitler, right? This sort of dictator. I mean, obviously there are differences, but and during those regimes, you didn't have a free press. So here you have a free press, and you have a president who cooks up this insane stuff, but you have to cover it in a way that's both honest and also that can continue. I mean, it's very tough. I don't envy print journalists.
And you also
television.
know a lot of them.
But I just think it's a very tough time. I think it's very tough for journalists, and I think I just think there's no reference for this. So we're in this uncharted world, which is very hard. But it's also, there's a lot to write about. I mean, a lot. Like every day something insane happens. And it's like late August, and there's still insane, there are 15 insane things to write about today. So I don't know.
Usually this is a dead time, in the news, because people go away in August. And instead we have babies in cages.
Defunding Planned Parenthood. Anyway, so it's very interesting. I have really been glad to be able to do that, and to sort of be able to sort of pivot in my career has been really cool. So, but all right, we are gonna go to questions.
Okay.
So we had a question right here.
Yes.
I'm gonna give. Can we give you?
Yeah.
Thank you. We're moving toward 2020, the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, are there any special things that you're doing as feminists?
Well, that's a really great question. I think it's shocking that we don't have the ERA. Alice Paul understood that the right to vote was not enough, and that without the Equal Rights Amendment, we were not in the Constitution. And women have to be in the Constitution. And right now, in the great state of Virginia, where many of our founders came from, right, like Washington and others, they're deliberating whether or not to endorse the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think we have to have the Equal Rights Amendment, because without it, women are not in our great Constitution, and we need to be in the Constitution. So if there's anything you can do for the state office of Virginia, if you can write letters, if you can make noise, do so, because we need it.
This is a very good state with 3 Democratic Congress people and 2 Democratic senators. Good job.
We have a very complicated country with 50 states, and each state has its own state house. And it took me all my life to understand the process of democracy in America because it's so complicated. But we do need an Equal Rights Amendment, and we're so close. And if we had an Equal Rights Amendment, women would be represented in the Constitution. And that is so important.
So this question is for Molly. After we defeat Trump in 2020, are you going to go back to writing novels? And if so, what would you consider?
So I think we got to defeat him. We got to take back the Senate. I mean, look, Trumpism is not going to be undone in 4 years. We're gonna, hopefully have a good candidate who wins in 2020. I hope. I mean, like, in my mind, the thing that matters the most is the Senate. Thank God Hickenlooper is running in Colorado. Like, thank God. Got to get, good people. I mean, if we could get Bennett to run in Montana, that would be amazing. Got to take back the Senate. And then we're going to be a country that's a mess. Like, even if we get Trump out of office, we have white supremacists, we have white nationalists. They're marching, they're armed, they're insane. I mean, the country is, we are, I mean, I don't know how we come back from this, honestly. Like, I think it's gonna be such a reckoning of like how we got here and how we undo this and where we go from here, and for women's rights and for, you know, and also the, like, you know, we have these immigrants, we have to, you know, what's happening in South America and Central America is terrifying. These people are not being taken care of. We have to figure out our country's relationship with, I mean, I think it's gonna be, we're in for a long time. I mean, I think
It's going to be hard. A lot of what's happening in Central America is climate change.
it's everywhere.
People can't grow crops,
And so I think we're gonna be.
and so they're trying to come north.
But I think we're gonna be, I think it's gonna be like I mean, I hope that it's gonna be a lot of healing for our country and a lot of like coming together and trying to figure out who we are as a country. But it's gonna be really scary too. I mean, I think we are in a very scary time with no president. So not to be too negative.
Molly, I want you to talk a little bit about the arena Democrats.
We have another question.
Okay.
Quick question. Of all of the books, Ms. Jong, of all of the books that you have written, do you have a favorite, a personal favorite? If so, what is it?
My favorite book is Fanny Hackabat Jones, which Julie Taymor and I are trying to make into a mini-series called Hackabout, about an 18th century woman who does everything, who becomes a highway woman and a prostitute in a ghetto and finds herself on a slave ship being transported to America. And every experience that you could possibly have, she has, and she survives. And she's writing this book for her only daughter, Belinda.
Actually, my mom wanted to call me Belinda, but my aunt stopped her. But then she named her dog Belinda.
My big black poodle. Okay, well,
The dog died, so, and I'm alive. So.
right. I now have two standard poodles called Colette and Simone. Colette being the French writer. Je suis une femme de lettres, je gagne ma vie. I am a woman of letters, I make my own living. And Simone is for Simone de Beauvoir.
All right, we have more questions?
Yeah.
If memory serves, I read Fear of Flying many, many years ago. Zipless fuck. How did you come up with that? What does that mean to you? Does it still mean something?
You know, I say in the book, the zipless fuck is a fantasy. And I describe an Italian movie where a beautiful widow is sitting in a train compartment going down to the boot of Italy. And you know she's a widow because she's all in
I
black.
have to say, that was the moment I stopped reading the book. That part, and I was like, my mother has done this?
No, but it was a fantasy.
I'm not sure which is worse, and then I closed it. Sorry. I know that it's not great, but I'm just saying that's what I
But you know, the thing is, you don't write books for your child, right? Anyway, you weren't even born when I wrote that book. So the zipless fuck is a fantasy. It's a fantasy of perfect sex between two people who don't know each other's names. And in the book, Isadora says, and I've never had one. But people never read that far. Look, you can't have a good sex life if you don't have fantasies. Fantasies are necessary. Before we fall in love, we have the fantasy of falling in love. And I think that to have a rich fantasy life is a great thing for a woman. And women have been deprived of their desires, their emotions. Nothing wrong with having fantasies. And in fact, it's the fantasy that enables you to fall in love when you meet your soulmate. And then you find a person who embodies it. Without that, how would you ever make a relationship with somebody? Fantasy's important. But it doesn't mean that you have to go to bed with everyone you meet. But when it was published, hi, Ken. Hi, darling. Molly and I are on stage. I can't talk. Okay.
Hang up. Hang up.
I hung up.
No, you didn't hang up.
Okay. He is the love of my life. We've been married for 30 years. And we were both very bad risks. And at our wedding, people were taking bets that we'd only last 2 weeks.
That is true.
Yeah.
They were married. She had been married 4 times. He had been married 5 times.
No, 3. Only 3. And we've been married 30 years. And Molly's going to make us our 30th anniversary party.
Yes, I am. All right, go.
Okay, congratulations. That
Thank
says
you.
a lot. I love the banter between you two. I also have a grown daughter, and I also have a very big Henry Miller connection, which I'm not going to go into too much, but I'm immersed in Tropic of Cancer right now. And it ties into the conversation of politics, you know, because it was so strong, anti-Semitism, you know, all the language, all the
Right.
things that were thrown at Henry, as you know, which are right there in the book. But it's a story of transformation. And I'm just, you know, I'd like to hear more about that in terms of where we are today and what we hide as a culture and so on.
We hide a lot, you know. And Henry Miller,
Where do you live?
he grew up in New York City. His parents were German immigrants. He grew up in Yorkville. His father was a tailor. And he went to Paris in 1932 because he felt that America was poisoning him, that all they cared about in America was money, and he didn't have any, and all he wanted was to write. And so he thought if you went to Paris, you could do it there. And he nearly starved in Paris. And then he met a nice nin who fed him and fucked him. And I always believed in my life that you should feed a man first. But anyway, I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, but Molly is a fierce feminist, and she's on the board of the Arena Democrats. And about 5 of their candidates got elected to the House of Representatives, and most of them are women, and half of them are women of color. And that's more than half. And that's what she's been working on.
Congressional is a congresswoman from here now, but I can't pronounce her name. It starts with an S. Yes. She's awesome. Yeah.
And some of those women I've met, and they're amazing. And they're now in the House of Representatives. And we need to do more of that. Women have to be deciding on health care, because in most families we're responsible for it. We have to be deciding on education, because we care deeply about education. We have to be deciding on care of elders, because we're the ones who do it. You know, my mother lived to be 101, and my sisters and I visited her constantly. And some days she was out of it, and some days she wasn't. And women, we are the caregivers. We gotta be in Congress voting on this stuff. And we are the ones who worry about, will our kids go to college? And men worry about it too, of course, but we are the hands-on ones. And we have to be represented, because those things are so important. Yeah. More questions.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here, and I just want to say, Ms. Jong, I'm over here on this side.
Hi.
Hi. This really isn't a question, it's just an acknowledgement. I was 21 in 1973, and I had been married a year. And I felt like I was in prison going to Tupperware parties and baby showers. And I wanted to do a zipless fuck. You know, when I read, I didn't want to, but I read your book, and within a year I was divorced. And I loved my 20s. And you were really an inspiration to me. I identified so much with what you said. I went to my bookshelf 2 days ago when I knew I was coming here. And I have Erica Jong books right on my bookshelf. Went to them, pulled them out, and Parachutes and Kisses, and Fear of 50. That's another great one, too. So I've really, my feminism is really, I owe a lot of it to you because you gave me the freedom to not just be a Tupperware and baby showers person. Thank you.
Thank you. That really makes me want to cry. It's really sweet.
Hi, my name's Jeff Webb,
Hi, Jeff.
and I just want to say something about writing and the creative process and the creative energy. And you queued all of that up beautifully, and thank you for your contributions. I'm just going to say here, speaking to the underact, and about some of her work, is that combining writing with creative energy with real time is a whole nother thing. And what we're going through right now is an unbelievable hyper acceleration of time. And to be able to calibrate with that and decide where to fit in and go on the ride and where you want to steer it, these are all really essential things that a lot of people are doing right now. And Molly is one of the best. And I am having a great time. I mean, this is such a hard time. It's such a difficult period that we're in. I went into politics, into the political world. When in 1973, witnesses were telling the Watergate Committee, no, kids, just don't do it. Washington's too dirty and everything else. I went into the system at the time everybody else was coming out. And I've had a lot of anguish over the last few years about whether I made a mistake and whether or not it was true that it was corrupt and there was nothing that could be done and all of that. I've served both in and out of government. So I'm out now. But I just want to say that I've had the good pleasure of being with Molly in real time, even though we don't see each other. And this is on Facebook, and so not on Facebook, on Twitter, which is a great way to aggregate real reporting, talking about how difficult it was for writers right now and for journalists, but there's a huge effort going on.
It's great.
People are trying, and in some ways it may be looked back on as a golden age of journalism because it's happening when the money and the models and things, in a way you were talking about in your own career, where the models weren't there to follow, you've got to make it.
Right.
And Molly is part of doing that, plus the most important thing to me, because you've got to keep going, is for it to be funny.
And she's so funny.
And
she is so funny, right?
Individually, together, whatever, have a great time in this because it's the only way that you can push back, but pull it together to be creative and push it in a direction.
With the humor. I
so
love
she's
that.
doing a great job, and I just wanted to say that because I know this is mostly about you.
I am so proud of my daughter. I mean, I'm going to make her, she's going to get upset if I do this, but I am so proud of her.
Another question.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm sure everybody's enjoyed it. I can't go into how enraged I've been about everything that's going on right now. But one thing I'd like you to talk about is how do you spin the complicity of people who are sitting on the sidelines right now and not doing anything? How do you make that humorous? Because every single day, I mean, even my friends, I'm like, what the hell? You're doing nothing. You're not helping people. You're not driving people to the polls. You're not doing anything. And, I'm one of those people, of course, and like a lot of people, I think our democracy's at risk right now. And so I can't figure out, I need you to help me figure out how to make that funny.
I think we got to get them to vote. Not everybody is going to be doing what we're doing in this world right now. So we get those people to the poll, we get them to do what they can do, They're not going to be protesting or writing letters or driving people to the polls, but they need to, we can still get those people. We can get them to vote. We can get them out there. That's what we saw in 2018. We saw that we can get those people out there. Like, we can push them to vote. What we really need is just for those people to vote and, to tell other people to vote. Not everyone is going to be out there, the way we are, and that's okay. I mean, personally, to me, I feel like our democracy is at risk. We have this insane president. Anything could happen. Thank God we have the House. Mitch McConnell is, I can't even say what I feel about Mitch McConnell because it's not appropriate. But, we're in a very tough spot, and the president is beholden to the NRA, which doesn't even have any money. He doesn't even realize that the NRA is, but whatever. Anyway, I was like...
they're all spending money on suits and sports cars.
I think there's a place,
Really?
those people can come out for us in November in 2020. That's what we need.
I'm talking a little bit about the members, especially in the Senate, the Republicans, who are doing and saying nothing about all the outrageous things that are going on and how history is going to look at them.
Oh, yeah. And Susan Collins, a great example is Susan Collins.
Oh, yeah.
Who was like, we looked at as like the one moderate who was, and then all of a sudden she really didn't do anything right. And Ben Sass. There are a bunch of like so-called good Republicans who've really done nothing. And I think history is not going to be kind to these people. You've already seen it. So I think we're going to see, there are a few really good Republicans who have really stood up there. And I don't want to like, Joe Wall. I'm not a Republican. I'm a Democrat. But there are some very good Republicans who have stood up there. Evan McMullin and Joe Walsh and, Rick Wilson and, Bill Kristol. Those guys have really stood up and said this is wrong.
And they've left the party.
And one of the great people has been Kellyanne Conway's husband. Right. Who will do, he tells
He is hilarious, too.
And he will do anything to stop Trump, he's told me. So, there are people there who are behind the scenes, and there's going to be many primary. I don't know that they'll win, but I don't think they'll win. But there are going to be primary challengers. This is going to be ugly for him. There are a lot of people who are focused on making this as horrible for him as possible. There are going to be PACs. We're going to buy ads. We're going to have, we're going to do as much mischief as we can to make it as hard for him as possible. And you just keep writing letters to Ben Sass and Susan Collins and be like, you guys, look, history is not going to be kind to you. Because it's not. You don't get to sit on the sidelines when the country is a mess like this. So, yeah. But have a little faith, but not too much faith. Everyone still needs to work really hard. But we're also doing our part.
I'm so proud of her.
All right, so should we sign books? I think we should sign books.
Right.